The late afternoon sun cast long shadows across Riverside Heights, one of the city's most expensive neighborhoods. Victoria Williams drove her silver BMW slowly down Maple Street, checking house numbers as she went. She had just finished a lovely visit with her mother, who lived in the assisted living facility nearby. At 78, her mother was still sharp as a tack, but Victoria liked to check on her every weekend. Victoria smiled as she remembered their conversation over tea. Her mother had been so proud when she told her about the new community outreach program she was launching. "My daughter, the state attorney," her mother had said with that familiar twinkle in her eye. "I always knew you'd change the world." As Victoria turned onto Oak Avenue, she noticed a police car in her rearview mirror. She didn't think much of it at first. Police patrols were common in this area. The residents here paid good money for their safety and made sure the city provided it. But after 3 turns, the squad car was still behind her. Her heart started beating a little faster. She checked her speedometer. 25 miles per hour in a 30 zone. She looked at her phone mounted on the dashboard. No texting while driving. Her seatbelt was on. Her registration was current. Everything was in order. The red and blue lights started flashing. Victoria felt that familiar knot in her stomach. Even after all her years in law school, even after building a successful career, even after becoming the top prosecutor in the county, this moment still made her nervous. She pulled over carefully, put the car in park, and placed her hands on the steering wheel where they could be seen. Officer Derek Collins approached her window with the swagger of someone who believed his badge made him untouchable. He was a 15-year veteran of the force, the kind of cop who saw everything as a potential threat. His hand rested casually on his service weapon as he walked up to the driver's side. "License and registration," he said without any greeting. His tone was cold, demanding. "Good afternoon, officer," Victoria said politely. "May I ask why you stopped me?" Collins' eyes narrowed. "I'll ask the questions here. License and registration. Now." Victoria reached slowly for her purse, narrating her movements. "I'm reaching for my purse now. My license is in my wallet." She had learned long ago that sudden movements during police stops could be misinterpreted. Better to be overly cautious. "What are you doing in this neighborhood?" Collins asked as she handed him her documents. "I was visiting someone," Victoria replied calmly. She had every right to be here, but something in his tone told her this wasn't going to be a routine traffic stop. Collins examined her license with unusual attention. "Victoria Williams. This address on Riverside Drive, that your real address?" "Yes, sir, it is. And this your car?" Victoria felt her patience being tested, but she kept her voice level. "Yes, it's my car. The registration should show that." Collins walked around the BMW, looking at it like he was examining evidence at a crime scene. He peered through the windows, checked the license plates twice, and even kicked one of the tires. Other drivers slowed down as they passed, curious about what was happening. "This is an expensive car," Collins said when he returned to her window. "Real expensive. What kind of work do you do?" Victoria hesitated. In her experience, telling police officers that she was a prosecutor could go one of 2 ways. Either they became immediately respectful, or they became defensive and hostile. Looking at Collins' aggressive posture, she suspected it would be the latter. "I work for the county," she said truthfully. "Doing what exactly?" "Legal work." Collins laughed, but there was no humor in it. "Legal work, right? You some kind of paralegal or something?" Victoria said nothing. She had learned that sometimes silence was the best response. "I'm going to need you to step out of the vehicle," Collins said. "Why? What's the reason for the stop?" "You were driving suspiciously." "Suspiciously how?" Collins' face reddened slightly. He wasn't used to being questioned, especially not by someone he clearly didn't respect. "You were casing houses. Looking around like you were planning something." Victoria almost laughed. She had been looking for house numbers to find her mother's facility, but she knew better than to argue with an agitated police officer on the side of the road. "Officer, I was simply looking for an address. I have every right to drive through this neighborhood. We'll see about that. Step out of the car." Victoria knew she was being targeted, but she also knew that resisting would only make things worse. She opened her door slowly and stepped out, keeping her hands visible at all times. Collins was shorter than she was, which seemed to irritate him further. He looked her up and down with obvious disdain. Victoria was dressed professionally in a navy blue blazer and slacks. Her hair was pulled back neatly, and she wore minimal jewelry except for her law school ring. Spread your legs and put your hands on the car, Collins ordered. Officer, I don't consent to a search. What's your probable cause? My probable cause is that you don't belong in this neighborhood and you were acting suspicious. Now put your hands on the car before I arrest you for obstruction. Victoria complied, placing her hands on the warm metal of her car's roof. She felt humiliated as Collins began searching her, his hands rougher than necessary. A few neighbors had come out of their houses to watch, some holding their phones up to record. As Collins searched her car, tossing her belongings around carelessly, Victoria forced herself to stay calm. She mentally cataloged every detail of the encounter: the time, the location, the officer's badge number, his behavior, his words. Her legal training kicked in automatically. What's this? Collins held up her briefcase. Work documents. I'm going to need to look through this. Those are privileged legal documents. You need a warrant. Collins slammed the briefcase shut. Don't tell me what I need. I know the law, Victoria bit her tongue. This man clearly had no idea who he was dealing with, and she was beginning to think that might be for the best. Let him dig his own grave. The whole ordeal lasted nearly an hour. Collins ran her license multiple times, called for backup that wasn't needed, and continued his fishing expedition through her car. All the while, Victoria stood beside her vehicle, maintaining her dignity despite the growing audience and the officer's increasingly erratic behavior. Finally, as the sun began to set, Collins seemed to realize he had nothing to charge her with. He walked back to her with obvious reluctance, her license and registration in hand. His earlier confidence had faded slightly, replaced by something that looked almost like uncertainty. I'm going to let you go with a warning, he said, as if he was doing her a favor. A warning for what exactly? Victoria asked. Just watch yourself in this neighborhood. People here don't like trouble. Victoria took her documents back, her hands steady despite her racing heart. Thank you, officer. I'll be sure to remember this encounter. Something in her tone made Collins look at her more carefully, but Victoria was already getting back into her car. As she drove away, she could see him in her rearview mirror, still standing by his squad car, looking confused and uncertain. Victoria drove home slowly, processing what had just happened. She had been stopped, searched, and humiliated for the crime of driving while black in an expensive neighborhood. It was a story as old as time, but it never got easier to experience. But Officer Collins had made one crucial mistake. He had no idea that the woman he had just harassed was about to become his worst nightmare. Victoria had barely driven 2 blocks when she saw the flashing lights again. Her heart sank as she looked in her rearview mirror. Officer Collins was pulling her over for the second time in 10 minutes. This couldn't be happening. She pulled over again, this time in front of a small park where several families were enjoying the evening. Children played on swings while their parents watched from nearby benches. The peaceful scene felt surreal compared to what was happening to her. Collins approached her car with even more aggression than before. His face was flushed and his movements were jerky and unpredictable. Something had clearly changed in the brief time since their last encounter. Out of the car. Now, he barked before she could even roll down her window completely. Officer, you just stopped me 10 minutes ago. What's the reason for this stop? I said get out of the car. Don't make me repeat myself. Victoria's legal mind was racing. This was harassment, plain and simple. There was no legitimate reason for a second stop so soon after the first. But she also knew that arguing with an agitated police officer could quickly turn dangerous. She stepped out of her car again, acutely aware of the families in the park who had stopped their activities to watch. Some were pulling out their phones. Good, she thought. The more witnesses, the better. I'm calling for backup, Collins announced loudly, speaking into his radio. I've got a suspicious individual who's being uncooperative. Victoria almost laughed at the absurdity. She had been completely cooperative during their first encounter. She had followed every command, answered every question, and submitted to his illegal search without resistance. How was that uncooperative? Officer Collins, she said, reading his name tag carefully. I've done nothing wrong. I complied with all your requests during our previous stop. Why are you stopping me again? How do you know my name? Collins demanded, his hand moving toward his weapon. It's on your name tag, Victoria said calmly, though her heart was pounding. The fact that he was reaching for his gun over such a simple observation terrified her. 2 more police cars arrived within minutes, their sirens wailing unnecessarily. Victoria couldn't understand why 3 patrol cars were needed for one woman who was clearly not a threat to anyone. The additional officers, Johnson and Rodriguez, approached the scene with confusion evident on their faces. "What's the situation, Collins?" Officer Johnson asked. "This woman has been driving around the neighborhood casing houses. She's got an attitude and won't cooperate with the investigation." Victoria watched Johnson and Rodriguez exchange a look. Even they seemed to realize that something wasn't right about Collins' story. "Ma'am, can you please place your hands behind your back?" Collins ordered. "Are you arresting me?" "On what charges?" "Suspicion of criminal activity and obstruction of justice." Victoria knew both charges were completely fabricated, but she also knew that resisting arrest, even an illegal one, would only make her situation worse. She placed her hands behind her back as ordered. The cold metal of the handcuffs bit into her wrists. She had put these same cuffs on countless criminals during her career as a prosecutor, but wearing them herself felt completely different. The humiliation was overwhelming, especially with all the witnesses watching from the park. Collins seemed to enjoy her discomfort. He tightened the cuffs more than necessary and pushed her roughly against her car. "Now we're going to search this vehicle properly," he announced. "You already searched my car during the first stop," Victoria protested. "That was a preliminary search." "This is a thorough investigation." Victoria watched helplessly as Collins began tearing apart her car's interior. He pulled out floor mats, emptied her glove compartment onto the ground, and even removed the spare tire from her trunk. Her work files scattered in the wind and her personal belongings were strewn across the sidewalk. The other two officers stood by awkwardly. Victoria could tell they were uncomfortable with Collins' behavior, but they weren't intervening. The thin blue line was protecting their colleague even when he was clearly in the wrong. "What exactly are you looking for?" Officer Johnson finally asked Collins. "Drugs, weapons, stolen goods? You never know with these people." Victoria's blood boiled at the phrase, "these people," but she forced herself to remain calm. Every word Collins spoke was digging his grave deeper, and she was memorizing all of it. A small crowd had gathered now. Parents from the park, residents from nearby houses, and people walking their dogs had all stopped to watch the spectacle. Many were recording with their phones, and Victoria was grateful for their presence. This encounter was being documented from multiple angles. "Find anything?" Rodriguez asked after Collins had been searching for nearly 20 minutes. "Still looking," Collins replied, though it was obvious he had found nothing incriminating. How could he? Victoria was a law-abiding citizen whose biggest crime was occasionally going 5 miles over the speed limit. Collins was becoming increasingly frustrated. His search had turned up nothing but legal documents, professional business cards, and the normal contents of a working woman's car. But instead of admitting his mistake, he doubled down. "These legal documents," he said, holding up some files from her briefcase. "How do I know these aren't forged?" "How do I know you didn't steal someone's identity?" Victoria stared at him in disbelief. "Those are case files from the district attorney's office. You can call and verify that." "Right. You expect me to believe that you work for the DA's office?" "I don't just work for the DA's office," Victoria said quietly. "I am the DA." Collins laughed loudly, a sound that made Victoria's skin crawl. "Sure you are. And I'm the chief of police." The other officers looked uncertain. Johnson picked up one of Victoria's business cards from the ground and examined it closely. His expression changed as he read it. "Collins," Johnson said quietly, "maybe we should call this in." "Call what in?" "There's nothing to call in. This woman is obviously lying about who she is." Rodriguez was now looking at Victoria's driver's license, which Collins had carelessly tossed on the ground with her other belongings. "Collins, this address." "This is in Riverside Heights." "That's a pretty expensive neighborhood." "So, anyone can fake an address?" Victoria watched the other officers growing more uncomfortable by the minute. They were starting to realize that their colleague might have made a serious mistake. But they were trapped by their loyalty to him and their reluctance to challenge a fellow officer in public. "Officer Collins," Victoria said, her voice steady despite her rising anger, "I'm going to give you one more chance to end this professionally. Check my identification again. Call the district attorney's office if you need to verify my employment. But this harassment needs to stop now." Collins's face turned red with rage. "Don't you threaten me." "I don't care who you think you are. Right now you're just another criminal I caught in the act." "In the act of what exactly?" Collins fumbled for an answer. "Driving while suspicious. Being where you don't belong." Even he seemed to realize how weak that sounded. The crowd of onlookers was growing larger and their murmurs were becoming more audible. Some were shouting questions about why 3 police cars were needed for one woman. Others were demanding to know what crime had been committed. "This is ridiculous," someone called out from the crowd. "What did she do wrong?" Collins spun around to face the spectators. "Everyone needs to back up and mind their own business, or you'll all be arrested for interfering with a police investigation." The threat only made people angrier. Phones were still recording, and Victoria could hear some people live streaming the encounter on social media. This whole incident was being broadcast to the world in real time. After what felt like hours but was probably only 30 minutes, Collins finally seemed to realize that he was in over his head. He had found no evidence of any wrongdoing. His backup officers were questioning his judgment, and the crowd was becoming increasingly hostile. "I'm going to let you go with a warning," he announced, as if he was being generous. "You're going to let me go because you have no legal reason to detain me." Victoria corrected him. Collins glared at her as he uncuffed her hands. "Just consider this your lucky day." Victoria rubbed her wrists where the metal had cut into her skin. "Officer Collins, I want your badge number, your supervisor's name, and the incident report number for this stop." "You don't need any of that." "Actually, I do, and I'm entitled to have it." Johnson stepped forward. "Ma'am, here's his badge number," he said, writing it on a piece of paper. "Our supervisor is Sergeant Murphy. He'll be filing the incident report." Victoria took the paper and looked directly at Collins. "Thank you, Officer Johnson. Your cooperation is noted." As Victoria gathered her scattered belongings and tried to put her car back together, Collins stood nearby, his confidence finally starting to crack. Something in her tone, her knowledge of police procedure, and her complete lack of intimidation was making him nervous. "You better watch yourself," he said quietly, as she got back into her car. Victoria looked at him through her open window. "No, Officer Collins, you better watch yourself, because this isn't over." As she drove away for the second time that evening, Victoria could see Collins in her rearview mirror, still standing by his patrol car, but this time his posture was different. The swagger was gone, replaced by something that looked suspiciously like fear. He should be afraid, Victoria thought, because he had just made the biggest mistake of his career, and he didn't even know it yet. Victoria drove straight home, her hands shaking slightly on the steering wheel. The adrenaline from the encounter was finally wearing off, leaving her feeling drained and angry. She pulled into her driveway and sat in her car for a moment, trying to process what had just happened. Her phone was buzzing with notifications. The videos from the park had already started spreading on social media. Her Riverside Heights stop was beginning to trend locally. Victoria watched one of the videos and felt her anger flare again. She looked composed in the footage, but she could see the tension in her posture, the careful way she moved to avoid giving Collins any excuse to escalate further. Inside her house, Victoria poured herself a glass of wine and sat down at her kitchen table. She spread out Officer Collins's badge number, the incident details, and the business cards that had been scattered during his search. One card in particular caught her attention. It was slightly bent from being thrown on the ground, but her title was still clearly visible. Victoria Williams, District Attorney, County of Riverside. She picked up her phone and called her assistant, Rachel. "Victoria, it's kind of late. Is everything okay?" "Rachel, I need you to do something for me first thing Monday morning. I need a complete personnel file on Officer Derek Collins, badge number 4471, Riverside Heights Precinct." "Okay. Can I ask why?" Victoria explained the evening's events while Rachel listened in stunned silence. "He didn't know who you were?" Rachel asked in disbelief. "He had no idea. And honestly, Rachel, that might be the best thing that could have happened. He showed me exactly who he really is when he thought there would be no consequences. What do you want to do? I want to know everything about this officer. His arrest record, any complaints filed against him, his training history, disciplinary actions, everything. I'll have it on your desk by 9 a.m. Victo." Rhea spent the rest of the weekend thinking about her next move. She could have called the police chief immediately, used her position to get Collins fired within hours. But that wouldn't solve the bigger problem. How many other people had Collins treated this way? How many hadn't had the education, resources, or social standing to fight back? On Monday morning, Rachel delivered a thick file that made Victoria's stomach turn. Collins had been the subject of 17 complaints in his 15-year career. Excessive force, racial profiling, illegal searches, verbal abuse. The complaints came from citizens of all backgrounds, but the majority were from people of color. Most disturbing of all, none of the complaints had resulted in serious disciplinary action. Collins had received a few written warnings and mandatory training sessions, but he was still on the street, still carrying a gun, still abusing his authority. Victoria was reviewing the file when her secretary buzzed her. "Ms. Williams, there's a Sergeant Murphy from the Riverside Heights precinct on line 2. He says it's about an incident report." Victoria smiled grimly. Word was starting to get around. "Put him through." "Ms. Williams, this is Sergeant Murphy. I understand there was an incident involving one of my officers this weekend." "That's correct, Sergeant. I want you to know that we take these matters very seriously. Officer Collins filed his report and I've reviewed the body camera footage." Victoria was surprised. "There was body camera footage?" "Yes, ma'am. Collins was wearing his camera during both stops." Victoria felt a surge of satisfaction. Collins had been so focused on harassing her that he'd forgotten his own department's recording policies. "I'd like to review that footage, Sergeant." "Of course. I have to say, after watching it myself, I have some serious concerns about Officer Collins's conduct." "I imagine you do. Would it be possible for you to come in this afternoon? We'd like to discuss this matter with you directly." Victoria agreed to meet at the precinct at 2 o'clock. When she arrived, she was escorted to a conference room where Sergeant Murphy, Captain Davis, and Internal Affairs Lieutenant Wilson were waiting. Their expressions were serious, almost grim. "Ms. Williams, we want to start by apologizing for Officer Collins's conduct," Captain Davis began. "After reviewing the body camera footage and witness statements, it's clear that this was an unacceptable incident." "I appreciate that, Captain, but I'm more interested in what you're going to do about it." Lieutenant Wilson leaned forward. "We've already initiated a formal internal affairs investigation. Officer Collins has been placed on administrative leave pending the outcome. Has this officer been the subject of previous investigations?" The three men exchanged uncomfortable looks. "There have been some complaints over the years," Murphy admitted. 17 complaints to be exact, Victoria said, opening the file Rachel had prepared. 17 complaints in 15 years, and he's still on active duty. Captain Davis looked stunned. "How did you get access to his personnel file?" "I'm the district attorney, Captain. I have access to the personnel files of every officer in this county." The room fell silent. Victoria could see the wheels turning in their heads as they realized the full implications of what had happened. "Ms. Williams," Captain Davis said slowly, "we had no idea Collins had stopped you. If we had known who you were, but that's exactly the problem, isn't it? Collins's behavior shouldn't change based on who he's dealing with. Every citizen deserves to be treated with respect and professionalism, regardless of their job title or social status." Lieutenant Wilson nodded. "You're absolutely right. This incident has highlighted some serious problems in our department." Victoria spent the next hour reviewing the body camera footage with the 3 supervisors. Watching it was even more disturbing than living through it. Collins's bias was obvious from the very first moment. His aggressive tone, his assumptions, his complete disregard for Victoria's rights. It was all captured in high definition. "This is textbook racial profiling," Victoria said as they watched Collins order her out of the car for the second time. He had no reasonable suspicion, no probable cause, no justification for any of his actions. "We agree," Captain Davis said quietly. "This is career-ending behavior. It should have been career-ending behavior years ago after the first few complaints." "Why wasn't it?" The 3 supervisors looked uncomfortable. Finally, Sergeant Murphy spoke up. "To be honest, Ms. Williams, complaints against officers often get buried in paperwork. Citizens file reports, but they don't follow up. Cases get dismissed or delayed until people give up. It's easier to transfer problem officers than to fire them." Victoria felt her anger rising again. "So Collins has been transferred around the county, spreading his poison wherever he goes?" That's essentially what happened, yes." Victoria stood up. "Gentlemen, let me be very clear about something. This stops now, not just with Collins, but with the entire culture that allowed him to operate this way for 15 years. "What are you proposing?" Captain Davis asked. "I'm proposing comprehensive reform, new training protocols, civilian oversight, mandatory reporting of officer misconduct, and real consequences for violations. I'm also proposing that we review every single arrest Collins has made in the past 5 years. Lieutenant Wilson looked pale. That could be thousands of cases. Then we better get started. As Victoria prepared to leave, Captain Davis made one final attempt at damage control. Ms. Williams, we hope we can handle this matter internally, quietly, for the good of community relations. Victoria turned to face him. Captain, this matter stopped being internal the moment Officer Collins put handcuffs on the district attorney for driving while black. This is going to be very public, very thorough, and very permanent. Are you planning to press charges against Collins? I'm planning to do whatever the evidence supports. If Collins violated my civil rights, and the video clearly shows he did, then he'll face the same consequences as any other criminal. As Victoria walked out of the police station, she felt a sense of purpose she hadn't experienced in years. This wasn't just about Collins anymore. This was about systemic change, about using her position to protect people who didn't have the power to protect themselves. Her phone buzzed with a text from Rachel. The mayor's office called. He wants to meet with you tomorrow morning. Also, Channel 7 News is asking for an interview. Victoria smiled as she got into her car. Collins had made the mistake of his life when he decided to target her. He thought he was dealing with just another black woman he could intimidate and dismiss. Instead, he had picked a fight with the one person in the county who had both the legal authority and the moral conviction to end his career. The irony wasn't lost on her. Collins had spent 15 years hiding behind his badge, using it as a shield to protect him from the consequences of his actions. Now that same badge was going to be the thing that destroyed him. Justice, Victoria thought as she drove home, was sometimes served ice cold, but it was still justice. The mayor's office felt tense when Victoria walked in Tuesday morning. Mayor Johnson, a political veteran who usually exuded confidence, looked genuinely worried. Police Chief Martinez sat beside him, his uniform crisp but his expression grim. They both stood when Victoria entered, which told her everything she needed to know about how seriously they were taking this situation. Victoria, thank you for coming, Mayor Johnson said, gesturing to a chair across from his desk. I think we all know why we're here. The Collins incident, Victoria replied, settling into her seat. I assume you've seen the footage. Chief Martinez nodded heavily. I've seen it. Multiple times. I've also reviewed Officer Collins's personnel file, thanks to your request yesterday. He paused, looking genuinely pained. Victoria, I owe you a personal apology. This should never have happened. Chief, I appreciate that. But what I really want to know is what you're going to do about it. Mayor Johnson leaned forward. Before we get into specifics, I need to ask, are you planning to take legal action against the department? Victoria had expected this question. Mr. Mayor, I'm planning to follow the evidence wherever it leads. If crimes were committed, I'll prosecute them. If civil rights were violated, I'll pursue federal charges. If departmental policies were broken, I'll demand accountability. Of course, the mayor said quickly. I just want to make sure we handle this properly. The last thing this city needs is a public relations nightmare. With respect, Mr. Mayor, the last thing this city needs is police officers who think they can abuse citizens without consequences. Chief Martinez spoke up. Victoria, I've already placed Collins on administrative leave. We're conducting a full internal affairs investigation, but I have to ask, what more do you want us to do? Victoria pulled out a folder containing her research from the past 24 hours. Chief, in the last day, my office has identified 17 formal complaints against Collins spanning 15 years. 17. That's more than one per year of his service. We're aware of his complaint history. Are you aware that similar patterns exist with other officers? Are you aware that your department has one of the highest complaint rates in the state for officers with more than 10 years of service? The chief's face reddened slightly. Our officers work in challenging conditions. So do officers in other departments. The difference is training, supervision, and accountability. Three of which seem to be lacking here. Mayor Johnson tried to steer the conversation back. What would you like to see happen, Victoria? Specifically? Victoria opened her folder. I want Collins prosecuted to the fullest extent of the law. I want a comprehensive review of every arrest he's made in the past 5 years. I want mandatory bias training for all officers. I want civilian oversight of internal affairs investigations. And I want a complete overhaul of your complaint process. That's quite a list, the mayor said. It's quite a problem, Victoria replied. Over the next 2 hours, Victoria outlined her concerns and demands. She presented evidence of systemic issues within the police department, patterns of behavior that suggested Collins wasn't an isolated case. The mayor-in-chief listened, occasionally pushing back, but mostly realizing they were in no position to negotiate. The federal government is already taking an interest in this case, Victoria mentioned casually near the end of the meeting. The FBI's Civil Rights Division has requested copies of the body camera footage. Chief Martinez looked like he'd been punched in the stomach. The FBI? Officer Collins violated my civil rights under color of law. That's a federal crime. The Bureau takes these cases very seriously, especially when they involve patterns of abuse. After Victoria left the mayor's office, she returned to her own building where Rachel was waiting with updates. The phones haven't stopped ringing, Rachel reported. News outlets, civil rights organizations, other police departments asking for comment. Oh, and Collins' lawyer called. Collins has a lawyer already? Apparently the police union assigned him one. Attorney name is Bradley Foster. He wants to meet with you. Victoria wasn't surprised. Police unions were notorious for protecting bad officers, often at the expense of public safety and justice. Set up a meeting for this afternoon. I want to hear what he has to say. Bradley Foster turned out to be exactly what Victoria expected. An older white man in an expensive suit who specialized in defending police officers. He brought Collins with him to the meeting, and Victoria got her first look at the officer since their encounter. Collins looked terrible. His usual swagger was gone, replaced by the nervous energy of someone who knew his career was over. He avoided eye contact with Victoria, focusing instead on his hands folded in his lap. Ms. Williams, Foster began, my client deeply regrets the misunderstanding that occurred this weekend. Misunderstanding? Victoria raised an eyebrow. Mr. Foster, your client illegally stopped me twice, conducted unlawful searches, detained me without cause, and violated my civil rights. That's not a misunderstanding. That's criminal behavior. Foster shifted uncomfortably. Officer Collins was following standard police procedures. Standard procedures for what? Harassing law-abiding citizens because of their race? Ms. Williams, I think we can resolve this matter without involving the media or federal authorities. Officer Collins is willing to issue a formal apology and accept whatever disciplinary action the department deems appropriate. Victoria looked directly at Collins. Officer Collins, do you understand what you did wrong? Collins finally looked up, his voice barely above a whisper. I thought I was doing my job. You were racially profiling me. You stopped me without cause, searched me without consent, and treated me like a criminal because I'm a black woman driving in an expensive neighborhood. I didn't. I wasn't, Collins stammered. You weren't what? Thinking about my race? The body camera footage says otherwise. You made assumptions about me from the moment you saw me. Foster tried to regain control of the conversation. Ms. Williams, surely we can work something out. Officer Collins has 15 years of exemplary service. Victoria laughed bitterly. Exemplary service? Mr. Foster, your client has 17 complaints in his file. 17. How is that exemplary? Those complaints were investigated and found to be without merit. No. Mr. Foster. Those complaints were buried by a system that protects bad cops at the expense of good policing. The meeting continued for another hour, with Foster trying various approaches to minimize Collins's culpability. He suggested stress from the job, inadequate training, personal problems. Victoria listened politely but made it clear that none of these excuses would change her course of action. Ms. Williams, Foster said finally, what will it take to make this go away? Victoria stood up. Mr. Foster, this isn't going away. Your client committed crimes. He violated my rights and the rights of countless other citizens over his 15-year career. The only question now is whether he'll face consequences alone, or whether we'll also address the systemic problems that allowed him to operate this way for so long. After Foster and Collins left, Victoria met with her senior prosecutors to discuss the case. The evidence was overwhelming. Body camera footage, witness statements, Collins' own words. The challenge wouldn't be proving the case. It would be handling the political pressure that was sure to come. The police union is going to fight this hard, warned Deputy D.A. Thompson. They'll claim you're biased because you're the victim. Let them, Victoria replied. I'm not prosecuting this case personally. I'm assigning it to the Civil Rights Division, but I am going to make sure it's prosecuted properly. Over the next few days, Victoria's investigation expanded. Her office began reviewing Collins' arrest records, looking for patterns of bias and misconduct. What they found was disturbing but not surprising. Collins had a clear pattern of targeting people of color for minor infractions while ignoring similar behavior by white citizens. His arrest rates for driving while suspicious and loitering were dramatically higher in minority neighborhoods. Several of his arrests had been thrown out by judges who noted the lack of probable cause. Most troubling of all, Victoria's office discovered that Collins had been transferred between precincts multiple times to avoid accountability. Each time complaints mounted, the department simply moved him to a new location where he could start fresh. "It's like a shell game," Thompson observed during one of their review sessions. "They keep moving him around so no one precinct has to deal with the full scope of his problems." Victoria was also receiving support from unexpected quarters. Other prosecutors from around the state reached out to share their own experiences with problematic officers. Civil rights organizations offered assistance. Even some police officers, disgusted by Collins' behavior, provided information about the culture of impunity within the department. But there was pushback too. The police union began a media campaign portraying Collins as a dedicated officer being railroaded by a vindictive prosecutor. Some city council members questioned whether Victoria should recuse herself from the case. Conservative media outlets suggested she was playing the race card for political gain. Victoria ignored the noise and focused on the evidence. By the end of the week, her office had built an ironclad case against Collins for civil rights violations, illegal detention, and abuse of power under color of law. They had also identified at least 6 other officers with similar patterns of behavior. "The grand jury is going to love this case," Thompson said as they finished their preparation. "The evidence is overwhelming." Victoria nodded, but she was thinking beyond Collins' individual case. "I want to send a message with this prosecution. Not just to Collins, but to every officer in this county. Badge or no badge, nobody is above the law." As she prepared to announce the charges against Collins, Victoria reflected on how far the case had come. What started as a routine traffic stop had exposed systemic corruption and abuse within the police department. Collins thought he was pulling over just another black woman he could intimidate with impunity. Instead, he had pulled over the one person with the power and determination to bring his entire house of cards crashing down. The announcement of charges against Collins was scheduled for Monday morning. Victoria had no doubt it would create a firestorm of controversy and political pressure, but she also had no doubt it was the right thing to do. Justice delayed was justice denied, and Victoria Williams was done with delays. The courtroom was packed on the morning of Officer Derek Collins' arraignment. Victoria had seen many high-profile cases during her career, but the energy in the room felt different this time. Citizens who had never set foot in a courthouse sat shoulder to shoulder with activists, journalists, and curious onlookers. In the front row, several people held pictures of family members who had their own encounters with Collins over the years. Collins sat at the defense table next to his lawyer, Bradley Foster. The once confident officer looked like he had aged 10 years in the past month. His uniform had been replaced by an ill-fitting civilian suit, and his hands shook slightly as he signed paperwork. Judge Patricia Hoffman called the court to order. "The state versus Derek Collins. Will the defendant please rise?" Victoria watched from the prosecutor's section as Collins stood unsteadily. This was the moment she had been working toward, not just Collins' individual accountability, but a public declaration that no one was above the law. "Mr. Collins, you are charged with violation of civil rights under color of law, a federal crime, as well as state charges of false imprisonment, unlawful search and seizure, and official misconduct. How do you plead?" Foster whispered something in Collins's ear before the officer spoke in a barely audible voice. "Not guilt." Your Honor. The plea wasn't unexpected, but Victoria was ready. Over the past month, her office had built an overwhelming case. The body camera footage alone was damning, but they also had witness testimony, expert analysis of Collins' arrest patterns, and evidence of the department's failure to address his misconduct. After the arraignment, Victoria held a press conference on the courthouse steps. The questions came fast and sharp from reporters who had been following the case since the initial videos went viral. "Ms. Williams, critics say you're pursuing this case because you're personally involved. How do you respond?" Victoria looked directly into the cameras. I'm pursuing this case because crimes were committed. Officer Collins violated my civil rights and the civil rights of countless other citizens. The fact that I experienced his misconduct personally only strengthens my resolve to ensure it never happens again. What about claims that you're being too harsh on a veteran officer? 15 years of service doesn't give someone the right to abuse their authority. If anything, it makes Collins' behavior worse because he knew better. He was trained better. He chose to ignore his training and violate his oath. Are you planning to prosecute other officers? Victoria paused. This was the question she had been expecting. My office is reviewing the conduct of several officers who showed similar patterns of misconduct. Anyone who violated citizens' rights will be held accountable, regardless of how long they've worn a badge. The trial preparation took months, but Victoria's team used the time wisely. They didn't just focus on Collins's case. They launched a comprehensive review of police practices across the county. What they found was a culture of impunity that went far beyond one bad officer. Deputy DA Thompson led a team that identified 47 officers with questionable arrest patterns. 12 had multiple complaints for excessive force. 6 had been transferred between precincts to avoid accountability. The department's Internal Affairs Division had dismissed or downgraded nearly 80% of citizen complaints without proper investigation. It's not just about individual bad actors, Victoria explained to her staff during one of their weekly meetings. The entire system is designed to protect officers instead of protecting citizens. Victoria began working with community leaders, civil rights organizations, and even reform-minded police officers to develop comprehensive changes. They proposed new training programs focusing on de-escalation and bias recognition. They designed civilian oversight committees with real power to investigate complaints. They created early warning systems to identify problematic officers before their behavior became criminal. The resistance was fierce. The police union fought every proposed change, claiming they would make officers afraid to do their jobs. Some city council members worried about the cost of reforms. Conservative media personalities accused Victoria of being anti-police and politically motivated, but Victoria had powerful allies too. The videos of her encounter with Collins had sparked a national conversation about police accountability. Civil rights leaders rallied support for the reforms. Citizens who had their own negative encounters with police came forward to share their stories. Even some police officers, disgusted by the behavior of their colleagues, privately supported the changes. The breakthrough came when 3 more officers were arrested for civil rights violations based on Victoria's investigation. Suddenly, the scope of the problem became undeniable. The mayor, facing pressure from federal investigators and potential loss of federal funding, announced his support for comprehensive police reform. The citizens of this county deserve better, Mayor Johnson said at a packed town hall meeting. We're going to implement every reform Ms. Williams has proposed, and we're going to do it immediately. Collins' trial began 6 months after his arrest. Victoria had assigned the prosecution to her Civil Rights Division, but she attended every day of testimony. She wanted Collins to see her there, wanted him to understand that his actions had consequences that went far beyond his own career. The prosecution's case was methodical and devastating. Body camera footage showed Collins' biased assumptions from the moment he first saw Victoria. Expert witnesses testified about patterns of racial profiling. Citizens who had been mistreated by Collins told their stories to the jury. Foster tried to argue that Collins was following department procedures, but the prosecution easily dismantled that defense. They showed that Collins had violated basic constitutional principles and his own department's policies. They demonstrated that his behavior was part of a pattern, not an isolated incident. The most powerful moment came when Victoria herself took the stand. She described the humiliation of being handcuffed and searched in front of neighbors and children. She explained how Collins' actions made her feel like a criminal in her own community. Officer Collins didn't see a fellow human being that day, Victoria testified. He didn't see a professional woman visiting her elderly mother. He saw a black woman in an expensive car, and he made assumptions based on that alone. Those assumptions led him to violate my rights and the Constitution he swore to protect. Collins's own testimony was painful to watch. He tried to justify his actions, claiming he was just being thorough in his investigation. But under cross-examination, he couldn't explain what he was investigating or why he thought Victoria was suspicious. The jury deliberated for less than 4 hours. When they returned with guilty verdicts on all charges, the courtroom erupted in cheers. Collins stared straight ahead, his career and his life in ruins. Judge Hoffman sentenced Collins to 2 years in federal prison and 5 years probation. He was also ordered to pay restitution and perform community service. Most importantly, he was permanently banned from working in law enforcement. "Mr. Collins," Judge Hoffman said during sentencing, "you took an oath to serve and protect the citizens of this county. Instead, you used your badge as a weapon to intimidate and harass people based on their race. Your actions brought shame to every honest police officer and violated the trust that communities place in law enforcement." Victoria felt a sense of satisfaction as Collins was led away in handcuffs, the same handcuffs he had illegally placed on her months earlier. But the real victory wasn't Collins' conviction. It was the systematic changes that had followed. The police department had implemented every reform Victoria proposed. Officers received mandatory bias training and regular psychological evaluations. Civilian oversight committees reviewed all complaints with real authority to discipline officers. Body cameras were required for all interactions with the public. Most importantly, the culture began to change. Officers knew they were being watched and would be held accountable for their actions. The number of complaints dropped dramatically, not because fewer incidents occurred, but because officers were behaving more professionally. Victoria established a civil rights unit within her office, specifically to prosecute police misconduct. The unit's mere existence sent a message that violations would be investigated and prosecuted regardless of who committed them. 6 months after Collins's conviction, Victoria received a letter that brought tears to her eyes. It was from a teenage boy whose father had been harassed by Collins years earlier. Ms. Williams. The letter read, "My dad always told me that police officers were people we couldn't fight, that we just had to accept whatever they did to us. But you showed me that wasn't true. You showed me that everyone has to follow the law, even the police. Thank you for making my neighborhood safer." Victoria kept that letter on her desk as a reminder of why her work mattered. Collins' conviction was just the beginning. The real work was building a system where no child had to grow up believing that justice wasn't meant for them. At a ceremony marking the first anniversary of the police reforms, Victoria addressed a crowd of community leaders, police officers, and citizens. "Change is never easy," she said. "There will always be people who resist progress, who prefer the old ways because they benefited from them. But we've proven that accountability and justice can coexist with effective law enforcement. We've proven that communities and police can work together when there's trust and respect." As Victoria looked out at the diverse crowd, police officers standing next to community activists, teenagers sitting beside elderly residents, she felt proud of how far they had come. Officer Collins's decision to profile her had been intended to intimidate and silence. Instead, it had sparked a movement that made the entire county safer and more just. Justice, Victoria reflected, often came in unexpected ways. Sometimes the worst moments in our lives became the catalyst for the most important changes. Collins thought he was targeting just another citizen he could abuse with impunity. Instead, he had awakened a force that would transform law enforcement for generations to come. The badge that he had used as a weapon against innocent people had ultimately become the very thing that brought him down. And in its place rose a new system built on accountability, respect, and the fundamental principle that in America, no one, not even those sworn to protect and serve, is above the law.